Welcome to This Explainer. When we think about American history, there are very few images as instantly recognizable as the Wild West. We immediately picture the cowboys, the massive cattle drives, and those wide-open, dusty plains. It's totally iconic, right? It's deeply ingrained in our culture thanks to literally decades of movies and TV shows. But here's the thing. According to historians, the real story of westward expansion was just way more complex, and frankly, a lot more difficult than any of those Hollywood legends suggest. So today we're going to look past those cinematic myths and dig into the actual historical reality of the American frontier. Let's get right into it.
Okay, so we've got to ask, was the Wild West actually wild? I think we all kind of carry around these preconceived notions of a frontier that was just completely devoid of rules, defined by constant nonstop action. But to really understand this era, we have to peel back all those layers of pop culture and look straight at the historical record.
Just look at this stark difference here between our cinematic expectations and what it actually took to survive. On one hand, you have the classic Hollywood myth, right? Adrenaline-fueled action and immaculate gunslingers wearing those impossibly clean white hats. But on the other hand, you have historical reality. The real frontier wasn't about dramatic shootouts at high noon. It was really about grueling, backbreaking agricultural labor, and just the sheer stubborn physical determination you needed to carve out a life in a totally unforgiving landscape.
To grasp just how rapidly this whole thing unfolded, we really just need to follow the timeline right after the Civil War. In 1862, the Homestead Act kicks off this massive wave of settlement. Then, a mere 7 years later, in 1869, railroad expansion fundamentally changes how people move around the country. That directly paves the way for the famous cattle drive era of the 1870s. And finally, as we push into the late 1800s, this incredibly rapid compression of space and people leads to some really intense frontier conflicts.
So let's start with that initial catalyst, the Homestead Act of 1862. The federal government was literally offering up a staggering 160 acres of land to settlers willing to farm it for several years. It sounded like the ultimate reward, a completely fresh start and endless opportunity. And honestly, it was a massive motivator. But as thousands rushed out into the Great Plains, they figured out pretty quickly that taming 160 acres of totally untamed, often super arid land was a monumental task. Just imagine the sheer isolation of a single family, miles away from any neighbors, trying to break through that tough prairie sod by hand? Yeah, not exactly glamorous.
But, having all that land is kind of useless without the infrastructure to support it. Enter the railroads. First, they rapidly expanded across the entire country, which immediately made westward travel so much faster and actually practical for the average family. But the real magic here was the economic connection. These steel arteries suddenly connected completely isolated settlers, along with their crops and cattle, directly back to those bustling, hungry eastern markets. It was absolutely the crucial catalyst that made westward expansion possible on such a massive scale.
Now, with those railroads bridging the gap, we enter the era of probably the most iconic frontier figure of them all, the cowboy. But to understand what their lives were actually like, we have to completely erase that Hollywood stereotype from our minds. Seriously, forget the movies. It's time to look at what this job actually entailed on a day-to-day basis.
A cowboy's main gig wasn't getting into dramatic bar fights. It was the cattle drive. And that meant herding massive, incredibly stubborn groups of cattle over hundreds of miles just to reach those new railroad towns for shipping. So forget any sense of glamorous adventure, this was purely a job of endurance. It was physically punishing, chronically low-paying, and it required working these incredibly long, exhausting hours through choking dust, brutal heat, and freezing storms. But perhaps the biggest shock to our modern, cinematic view of the Wild West is this one simple ratio: 1 in 4. Keep that number locked in your mind for a second, because it is about to completely shatter the visual picture of the frontier that pretty much all of us grew up with.
So that 1 in 4 actually represents the true diversity of the West. Historians point out that roughly 25% of actual cowboys were Black or Mexican American. And why does this matter? Well, because this highly diverse reality was almost entirely erased by popular 20th century Western entertainment. The real frontier was actually a vibrant melting pot of cultures and backgrounds, with people working side by side in these totally grueling conditions. Understanding this brings some much-needed accuracy to our historical perspective, finally restoring the faces and the voices that the movies just completely left behind.
Okay, moving away from the open plains and into the settlements, we hit the infamous boom towns. Fueled by railroads and the mining industry, places like Dodge City and Deadwood basically exploded overnight. And yes, to be fair, in those very early days before established law enforcement and local governance could really catch up, they absolutely did experience genuinely high levels of lawlessness.
But if you look at the reality for the vast majority of settlers, that whole Hollywood expectation just completely falls apart. I mean, we expect daily gunfights and dramatic saloon brawls, right? But the reality was actually the slow, back-breaking process of building brand new communities entirely from the dirt up. We picture constant outlaw action, but the reality was battling intense isolation, devastating crop failures, and extreme, unpredictable weather. It definitely lacked that cinematic drama, but honestly, it required a profound, quiet kind of courage.
Now, as we marvel at this era of immense growth, we also have to look soberly at the severe consequences. The story of the Wild West simply cannot be told without facing its devastating impact on the Native American nations who had already been living on these lands for centuries before this massive migration even began.
It really became an equation of mounting pressure. As American ambition grew, the relentless westward expansion of settlers, the railroads, and the U.S. military steadily enclosed what used to be open plains. This created immense, totally unavoidable pressure on native territories, rapidly depleting critical resources and threatening traditional ways of life. Ultimately, this pressure cooker led to a tragic series of conflicts throughout the late 1800s as two entirely different worlds collided head-on.
And beyond those physical conflicts, the reality for Native nations was largely dictated by the government. The historical records clearly show that federal policy during this era fundamentally altered Native ways of life. This included the forced relocation of entire populations to reservations, which dramatically reduced both their landholdings and their ability for self-governance. This is an essential, totally factual part of the historical record. It's a sobering and often incredibly underrepresented history, but it is absolutely vital if we want to fully understand the true cost and get the complete picture of American westward expansion.
So, to kind of summarize what we've covered in this explainer today. Yes, the Wild West was certainly a real place and time, but it was far, far more complicated than the legends suggest. Behind those cinematic cowboy stories and dramatic boomtowns lies a much fuller history. It's a history characterized by grueling hard labor, incredibly ambitious settlement, and a surprisingly high level of diversity. And crucially, it was an era that brought a significant, tragic, and lasting impact on the Native nations who originally called this land home. The actual truth of the frontier is just so much more nuanced and frankly a whole lot more compelling than the fictional movie versions we've been fed.
Which brings us to an inevitable breaking point. With the frontier rapidly closing, resources dwindling, and tensions boiling over everywhere, what exactly happened when Native American nations fought back against this overwhelming expansion? Well, that is a profound and incredibly complex piece of history, and it's exactly what we're going to uncover in our next explainer. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time as we continue to explore the true stories of our past.